I almost had an anxiety attack reading the paper. Climate change, the world's on fire, our democracy's in shambles. It's so anxiety provoking. I was just thinking last night about this exact issue. It's like cannabis helps us forget, and otherwise our brains would be overloaded and shut down. Forgetting is an important part of what our brain does, or would be overloaded.
Hi friends, and welcome to Different Leaf the podcast. I'm Britt Smith, here to let you know it's not just you. We're all feeling the stress of this crazy year. I think we can all agree 2020 has kind of sucked so far, especially for folks who were already dealing with mental health issues. This episode, we're going to talk about how we can safely use cannabis to treat anxiety, how to avoid panic from taking too much THC, and what to do if you do take too much, and how marijuana can help with depression. For me, 6 months of social isolation has definitely been the hardest thing, and as my fellow immigrants know, it really sucks to be an ocean away from your loved ones right now. Many of you are working and learning from home, trying to keep your kids focused in virtual classrooms, and a lot of people have lost their jobs, and millions of us have lost loved ones. On top of the pandemic, the West Coast is on fire. We've got a racial justice movement, and in case you forgot, we have an incredibly contentious general election 40-something days away. But one thing is for sure, whatever you're feeling right now, you're not alone. In spring of this year, phrases like, "Am I having a panic attack?" and "anxiety attack symptoms" hit an all-time high on Google. In a recent report, the CDC said that between April and June, nearly 1/3 of American adults said they had experienced symptoms of anxiety or depression, which is about 3 times what it was last year. 1 in 4 young adults, aged 18 to 24, seriously considered suicide in June, which is about double the rate of last year. And 1 in 4 young adults have also started using substances, or they've increased consumption rates of the stuff they already are using as a way to cope with the emotional toll of COVID-19. And all of these issues were more prevalent among young men of color. There's also been a recent increase in opioid overdoses, which has been linked to the pandemic. Medical marijuana recommendations have been on the rise in Arkansas, and recreational cannabis sales have been breaking records in Illinois, Colorado, and Oregon. Needless to say, we could all do with a safe and healthy way to just chill out. Enter cannabis. This episode, we're going to get a little medical guidance on how to properly recuperate with marijuana so that we can all continue to survive 2020. Here to soothingly talk us through the whole thing is Dr. Peter Grinspoon. He's a Harvard-trained primary care physician at Mass General Hospital who specializes in medical cannabis. He's also an instructor at Harvard Medical School. He's a board member of Doctors for Cannabis Regulation, and he's the author of Free Refills, A Doctor Confronts His Addiction. Hi, Dr. Grinspoon. How are you?
Doing well today. How about yourself?
Yeah, I'm doing okay. I'm doing all right. For 6 months into a pandemic, I am hanging in there.
It gets old, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm pretty tired of it already. I think a lot of people out there are. Before we went into the pandemic, I had actually been dealing with some serious anxiety, and I'd been diagnosed with severe depression. And so right as 2020 kicked off, I was like, I'm getting into a good place now. And then like 3 months into it, all of this stuff happens, and my anxiety has definitely been building back up throughout the pandemic, and I can kind of tell because I'm consuming way more marijuana and hemp than I was at the beginning of the pandemic. And I know that it's because I'm no longer going to an office to do my work. I'm just able to sit around the house. So my smoking has increased, and now I'm smoking every day. I know that it's definitely not as bad as tobacco, but is it bad for me to be smoking every single day? Is it a reliance thing, or should I be decreasing it?
Well, it's hard to generalize. First of all, smoking or vaping? Because
smoking.
Okay, because
I think I know what you're gonna say.
Vaping dried flower is a lot safer than smoking. I'm not a huge fan of the vape cartridges because they have a lot of chemicals in them, but to get the cannabinoids, you only need to heat it up to about 400 degrees Celsius, 300 or 400 degrees. And when you smoke it, you heat it up to like 1100 degrees Celsius, and you just like incinerate everything. And you get the tar and all the chemicals and the smoke, and it irritates your lungs. It gives you that chronic bronchitis. So I'd say if you're going to do it every day, it would be a lot safer to just get one of those machines that heats it up and just grind it tastes better. It's much more efficient. The machine pays itself off because you don't really need to incinerate everything to get the cannabinoids. You get them much more efficiently by vaping the dried flower. So I would say, one of the concerns about using it every day, if you're using it inhalationally, is the effect of the smoke on your lungs.
Right.
Now, it hasn't been shown to cause COPD or lung cancer, but it does cause sort of a chronic irritant bronchitis. And I would just say, because of COVID, if it attacks your lungs, that's where most people die. You want your lungs to be as healthy as possible. So if you say, am I using it too much? I would say the answer is, you can't really say yes or no, but the answer is going to be much more towards the no side if you're not smoking it every day, if you're vaping the dried flower.
Sure. So you think that other methods of ingestion, if people are using every day, because it's not really attacking the lungs in such a way, it's not as dangerous? Or is it dangerous at all to be using every day, all day?
Well, I would say it's definitely not advisable to smoke cannabis or anything else every day. Whether you use cannabis every day is a bad thing or not depends on whether you're using it medically or not. Some people do get in trouble with cannabis and use it to avoid reality and to avoid other problems. So, I'm not your doctor. So if you say using it every day, whether you're using it appropriately and in a healthy way instead of, benzodiazepines or other heavy psychiatric drugs that might be more harmful, or whether you're using it to escape reality, I can't really say whether you're using it too much. People can use it in a very helpful way, or like any psychoactive medication, they could use it in a harmful way. So it's really hard to generalize if someone says, I'm using it every day. Am I using it too much, or am I using it helpfully or harmfully, until you know a little bit more about the circumstances.
Right. So there's a lot of people that are trying cannabis for the first time during the pandemic, especially here in Massachusetts, since we've got a lot of people staying at home and a lot of legal recreational marijuana shops that are now able to be open. So there's some first-time users out there. I want to talk to them about how to safely start using cannabis for anxiety if you're just buying it on the recreational side and you don't go to a doctor and get all the advice. What would be your tips for how to using cannabis for anxiety properly?
Well, the thing about cannabis and anxiety is that it's quote unquote biphasic, meaning that at low doses, it tends to help anxiety. And at higher doses, unless you're a very experienced user, it can worsen anxiety. So for these new users, the key is to keep the doses very, very low until you get used to it. So, they say start low and go slow. And that's really the critical component. I would say the only way to get into trouble with cannabis when you're just starting out with it is to go too aggressively on the dose. You don't want to go into a dispensary and say, this brownie looks delicious, and eat the whole thing, because then you get too much and you can get a really bad anxiety or panic attack. Mm-hmm. And that is an awful experience, and it could even be dangerous. So, for example, with my patients who have never used cannabis before, I say, if you're going to make a mistake with the dose, we're going to make a mistake of not taking enough and being disappointed. And then the next day we'll take a teeny bit more, and we'll probably still be disappointed. And then the next day we could take a teeny bit more, and eventually we'll get to the right dose. And we're just not going to get to too high a dose, because that can cause anxiety. We're trying to treat anxiety here. If they're going to use it inhalationally, we'll start with like one puff, maybe in the early evening. And then if, they happen to take too much, they could just sleep it off. Or with a tincture, we'll start with like one drop. Or with an edible, we'll get the smallest little piece of candy or whatever they sell at the dispensary, and then we'll cut that in half and take the smallest possible dose, maybe mid-evening, and then try a little bit more the next night, or try the same amount for a couple of nights in a row if you've never used cannabis, because sometimes you have to use it 3 or 4 times for it to have any effect if you've never used it before. The brain has to become kind of sensitized.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's a very strange thing. I remember in high school, my friends and I were first trying it, and we were like, are we high yet? Are we high yet? Because it doesn't do anything the first couple of times you try it. It's a common phenomenon that nobody really understands.
I've never heard of that, really. I got high as a kite the first time I tried.
Oh, really? A lot of people don't, because the receptors have to sensitize themselves. Oh. But so as long as people are really patient, really judicious, and they start really slowly, and they don't make the beginner's mistake, which is you take an edible. An edible can take a couple hours even to kick in. So a lot of people take an edible, nothing happens. in 45 minutes and they're like, oh, nothing happened. I'm going to take another dose. And then, within 2 hours, they've taken a double dose and they're way too high. And again, that can cause a really bad anxiety attack. So don't ever do that. Don't take more than one dose on a given day, and take your time getting to the right level. And if you do that, you're not going to get in trouble.
There's a lot of people out there that have had that experience with edibles. I'm one of them.
So am I.
The worst time that I had too much of an edible, I took it right before I got on an airplane. And
oh, that sounds like fun.
Oh my gosh. It is not cool to be suddenly really high in the sky and think, oh my gosh, how did I get up here? And I'm scared of heights. So I just thought it would lower my anxiety before I flew. But I took too much of it and it kicked in just as we started climbing to 30,000 feet, which is just the worst time for the anxiety to kick in. How do you get rid of that sort of panicky feeling if you've eaten too much?
Well, first of all, the mistake you made is you didn't know the dose.
I didn't know the dose. Yeah, that's
right. So if you had taken like 1 or 2 milligrams, a very small dose, it might have really helped your anxiety. But you took an unknown dose, which turned out to be a huge dose. And that was exactly what we're talking about. So if you take too much and you're having an anxiety attack, now, first of all, if you have smoked it, it only lasts for a couple hours. Whereas if you've taken an edible, it can last, like 6 to 8 hours. So it's definitely going to be a worse experience if you've taken an edible because you're sort of stuck with having taken too much for longer. And, it seems like forever because one of the things cannabis does is slows your perception of time. So It can definitely seem like, several centuries, though it will wear off. You have to remind yourself that it does wear off and you're going to be fine. No one's ever overdosed on cannabis or no one's ever died from an overdose on cannabis. So mostly you just find a friend, tell them what's happening, have them be supportive, calming, and soothing. Mm-hmm. If you're not in the middle of a pandemic, sort of hold hands and just kind of relax. Listen to relaxing music. Maybe sit down outside somewhere peaceful. People say CBD really helps because that can antagonize the effects of THC and it's sort of naturally relaxing. So a lot of people recommend taking a somewhat hefty dose of CBD. Generally, almost always, it'll just go away by itself. If, you're having, on the very rare occasions, you're having like a true full-blown panic attack, or you're having like chest pain or anything like that, which can happen. It's extraordinarily rare, but then you might have to go to the emergency room. Fortunately in Massachusetts, nothing bad will happen if you say, I took an edible, I'm having an anxiety attack, help me. There's still some states where it's illegal, and then that's a lot more complicated. This is one of the reasons why we're working so hard to make it legal across the country. The more legal it is, the safer it is, because you could actually tell people what's happening. It's only when it's illegal and people have a bad reaction, again, which is pretty rare, but if they do have a bad reaction, the worst case scenario is you can't actually tell the doctor what's happening because you're worried about getting into criminal trouble. So, the most dangerous thing about any drug is the fact that it's illegal, which is why I'm such a huge proponent of ending the war on drugs.
You may not be able to pass the joint right now, but you can still share the love. Subscribe to Different Leaf, the podcast, wherever you're listening to us, and follow us on social media at Different Leaf. You can get a sneak peek of the gorgeous pages of our magazine at differentleaf.com. So we've talked about how to consume on a daily basis for anxiety. Let's talk about something that's, I guess, somewhat connected, which is depression. We've been hearing a lot that people's anxiety and depression has been going up during the pandemic for obvious reasons. What do you think people should know if they're trying to consume for depression rather than anxiety? Because, one is sort of a heightened sense of fear, and the other one is like almost a numbing sense. But you're using the same cannabis in the same way. How do you know what to use and how to use it for those two different issues?
That's a complicated issue because depression and anxiety are closely linked in the brain. And a lot of the traditional treatments overlap. Like we use SSRIs, in my primary care practice to treat depression and anxiety. And it's interesting that we use cannabis to treat depression and anxiety. Cannabis does cause like this mild euphoria. The psychiatrists have studied cannabis, and The question is whether it has a long-term benefit on